ground-based noise committee members, staff, and the public to, I believe, our second ground-based noise meeting since we reorganized after the pandemic. Today, we will be conducting the call via Zoom. For public participation, Michelle's going to read the rules for written and public vocal comments, but we will be using the raised hand function in both the how do we call it? The attendees. I'm sorry, I'm flipping back and forth between screens here for both the panelists and the attendees. And with that, Michelle, would you mind reading the instructions for public comment during a video conference meeting?
Oh, thank you very much. Public participation. Written public comments can be emailed to info@sforoundtable.org and should include specific agenda item to which you're commenting. Spoken public comments will also be accepted during the meeting through Zoom. And the way that you do that, there's two ways. One is under the participants. You click on the participants at the very bottom of your screen, and on the far right, it says raise hand. And once you raise your hand, we'll call on you after the membership has had an opportunity to comment. I don't think that we have our comments, our chat on, so that would be the way to communicate. Thank you.
Is the raise hand function? Yeah, I don't see chat on my end. So raised hand is the way to go. I've called to order. Do we need to do a roll call, Michelle?
I think it's a good idea.
Okay.
And I'd like to ask Angela to do that, please.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, good morning. Sorry, I was not prepared for a roll call for a subcommittee, but if you give me 1 second, I can pull the list of all of our cities.
Oh, no.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You know, why don't I just go ahead and do the roll call for the membership of the ground-based noise meeting? So I will just call, and if you could please say present. So Ann Schneider, chair of the ground-based noise committee. Al?
Present.
Councilman Hillsborough. Boy, this is funny. The other represented city is Councilman Ricardo Ortiz, and I hope he will be joining us. We have our staff person, Michelle Rodriguez, and staff person, Angela Montez. We have our consultant, Justin Cook from HMMH, Linda Wolin from the county. Linda, I'm not sure what title to give you now.
Today I'm representing Supervisor Dave Pine, who is a member of the committee.
Excellent. Thank you, Linda.
Thank you.
I see that we have Bert Ganong from SFO Noise Roundtable and Kathleen Wentworth, golly, representing I am sorry, folks, Representative Jackie Spear. And then from the public, I'm just going to read this into the minutes then. We have Darlene, I don't always have everyone's last name, Darlene from Palo Alto, Glenn Morse, I believe also from Palo Alto, and Peter Grace from Brisbane. Did I miss anyone?
This is Bert Ganong. I represent San Francisco Airport, not the Roundtable.
Oh, I'm sorry, Bert. Again, no, I wake up in about 2 hours. So with that, Angela or Michelle, you read in the instructions, so we don't need to read the whole set of instructions?
No, ma'am.
Okay, the main purpose of today's meeting is to really make sure that we have identified all the unique asks to go into the spectral analysis study. And with that, I am going to introduce Justin from HMMH. Our first item to look at is to complete the review of the scope of work. Justin, it's in your court.
Thanks, Anne. So I will, I'll be sharing a number of materials today. So please let me know if you do not see my screen. And I'm going to be switching back and forth, and I'll try to go slow. So
Justin, will that material be sent to us if it hasn't already?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, not a problem.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. So let me know if you could see my screen. So
yes,
we can. Okay. So the first part of the scope of work in the first part was to collect GIS information specifically from the airport. The HMMH team's been hard at work digitizing that in the model. This is actually a side 3D view of the model as it currently exists. You could see the digitized buildings, the terminal buildings, the hotel, for example. And we also were able to spend a good amount of time digitizing, the buildings within the communities nearby. And you could see that terrain is also currently inputted. So at this point in time, I just wanted to briefly show you what has already gone into the model. We will be continuing to add information. But for now, in terms of the GIS data that we have, we are pretty much ready to go with all that collection and input. So I'm gonna now switch over to the actual scope of work here.
And you mind any questions?
Sure.
Thank you. I put myself on mute. Any questions?
If you don't mind,
Please go ahead.
Justin, you say you have the GIS information. What specifically, is there like a category of data points you're looking for? Or is that listed out here in your scope of work?
Yeah, it's really, well, we obtained city information, that's public information usually. And where there's not heights of buildings, we actually went in and determined that ourselves to give it that three-dimensional aspect, so we could get all the reflections in the model. But what we asked of the airport, for example, was shape files of the current airport layout plan, which includes all the buildings in the terminal area. And so we have what I wanted to say is we have currently a good data set that kind of reflects the project area. I don't anticipate that we'll need any additional GIS data. But we will definitely, as we really start to get into the study, we'll definitely let the subcommittee know if there's anything else that we may need.
So Justin, could you just, do you have a list of the shape files that you got from SFO? So there's just a little bit more clarity on how, what are your overlays and how did you determine heights of the buildings on cities that you didn't actually have information? Do you have a list of those shape files?
There's hundreds of them. It's about 2 gigabytes worth of data. I'd be happy to provide some sort of, list. In terms of data from the city, that's also something that we could share. That's usually public information. In terms of whether it's from the city or the county, that we obtain all the time. In terms of determination of heights, usually it's a combination of aerial photos and Google Earth Street View to best determine heights. I believe most of the data actually had height information in. We just had to do some tweaks to make sure that it was in the right metric or unit. So
Justin, when you say cities, are you talking about Millbrae and Burlingame or what?
Everything in the nearby area, and we'll get into kind of the study area soon.
Okay.
But yes, we have information for the entire Bay Area. It's pretty elaborate. So like I said, I think once you see the project study area and we discuss that, I think you'll see we have a lot of that information. And if we do, if the study area, for example, is expanded at all, and we find that we're missing information, we will definitely let you know, but we'll probably try to go back and obtain it like we usually do.
Excellent. This is Ann. I want to welcome Councilman Ricardo Ortiz to the Ground-Based Noise meeting. Thank you, Mr. Ortiz. We are just getting started on the first item. Justin, would you mind going back to the 3D slide that you showed so
Sure.
that Councilman Ortiz can see it? And then I had a question on it
There you go.
because it could just be the difference in scale. We know that basically we're going uphill on all of this, but it looks pretty flat in here. Is that just simply this particular
It's-
rendering?
Yeah, it's just the view of it. It's the terrain is all inputted correctly. So if you looked from the airport view, you would see it differently, and you would see that it's accurate, as in going further, increasing
Excellent.
in elevation. Yes. It's
Any
just the view.
questions?
Yeah.
And Michelle, you might have some suggestions. I know that Justin has many slides and many subject areas. Is it to me, it's easier to take questions as we go along. I think that that's the same for Councilman Royce. Do we have any
Sure.
other questions here? And how do you want me to handle public comment as we go, or go through the presentation and then come back? Justin, you might just have to be prepared to be flipping back and forth.
Not a problem on my end. Yeah.
Okay.
And then one more
I
quick
don't-
question. One more quick,
Sure,
if I
certainly.
might, and just a clarification. This is of a point of time, is of today, right? You've not done any trend analysis as part of this analysis, right?
That's correct. This is just trying to get a jump start on this
Okay.
study and input as much GIS data as we could, and especially as we've received from the airport.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay,
Mhm.
any further questions? All right, and we're going to hold the public comment until we get farther along. Thank you. Go ahead, Justin, back in your court.
Okay. All right, we'll switch to the scope. So what I'll do now is kind of just quickly go over the scope. I know we did that in the last meeting, but I think it would be helpful for our discussions moving forward if we understand that. So we'll be modeling 6 scenarios within what we're going to call a project study area that we'll discuss a little bit later, I think, in the next discussion, actually, next item. The scenarios differ really by runway and by takeoff point, right? So we have each scenario will have 2 aircraft types associated with it. We'll have a point where we place the aircraft. One will be at the start of takeoff roll, and one will be at a secondary takeoff point, or the transition point, where it changes during takeoff. And then we'll be doing that. As we do that, we will be turning vegetation on and off, essentially, in the model to see the difference with and without vegetation. And we'll be doing that for runway 1 left, 1 right, for both points. And then we'll also be doing a staggered scenario with a kind of simultaneous takeoff on runway 1 left and 1 right. And lastly, which we added per conversation last time, was scenario 6 with aircraft departing on runway 28 left or runway 28 right at the secondary takeoff point. And we wanted to get clarity, obviously, before we get going on which runway this subcommittee would like to see modeled. HMH would offer a recommendation to model 28 right, simply because we believe, although 28 left is a little bit closer distance-wise, where the secondary takeoff point would likely be behind or in between, the terminal would be in between that point and the communities or the community. And you would get shielding effects from the terminal. And if we're looking for a, I guess, worst case scenario aspect for 28 takeoffs, HMH believes that 28 right would be actually worst case. And that just has to do with if you think of the terminal building as a barrier, 28 left would be closer to that barrier and there would be more reflections and shielding going on. Whereas 28 right would likely have noise being shielded somewhat by the terminal, but also going over, up and over, just due to distance away from that so-called barrier. So hopefully that makes sense, but we're really looking for your input and decision here before we get going.
Okay, questions from the membership? Then I have a question. On the scenario 6, and this is how I envision it. There's a 28, so let's say 28 right takeoff, and it's already in the air at the point where the noise might be above the terminals, but captured by the hotel. Will the work that you're doing be able to model that?
Yeah, the secondary takeoff point would have, you know, it's on that pivot. So there wouldn't necessarily be, you know, altitude associated. It's kind of at an angle, right? The aircraft's at an angle. And that's kind of why we would recommend 28 right. The hotel would, obviously it's digitized and in the model. So any reflections off the hotel would be picked up. And especially, like I said, I think 28 right would have instances of low frequency noise carrying kind of through or up and over the terminal buildings.
So do we need to choose today then to say, yes, go ahead with 28 right versus left?
Correct.
In which case I'd like to hear from,
Correct. Yes.
from Linda, Ricardo, and Al. Pardon the
Kathleen and Bert.
familiarity.
Mhm.
And
Madam
Rick,
Chair, if I
Amber.
could.
Please go ahead, Councilman.
So the one thing that I thought of, and it's something you brought up a while ago, was the reverse thrust of landing aircraft on 28L and 28R. So I don't know if we're going to look at that at all.
Yeah, in this scope, we aren't. And I would say that the difficulty there is that there's no data associated with a reverse thrust, you know, the frequency characteristics of a reverse thrust, at least in our database or databases around. I don't believe there's, we would have to go out and probably measure such noise, which is much more elaborate. And that would occur obviously before even the terminals in the use of the reverse thrust but to answer your question, it's not in this scope of work to look at that reverse thrust.
Okay, it struck me that was one of the things that we had talked about, and but I get it. We have to limit it at some point. So just, you know, worth the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
That is one of the other members has been highly focused on that topic. And so if that is something that the committee as a whole wants to look at, we can have an offline discussion with HMMH about what would that mean. So I want to make sure to just keep it in play if the majority of you are thinking that that's something of importance.
Just to comment on 28 arrivals then with reverse thrust, are we thinking that maybe that's more of the noise that might be hitting some of the lower, closer to El Camino, Burlingame households? It's been a while since I've thought about reverse thrust on 28 arrivals.
My sense is that compared to the backlast from 1RL, it's not as big, but again, it's one of those things I figure since we're talking about this, I would think that in some cases that reverse thrust is louder than the backlast from takeoff on 28L or R.
So Michelle, how can we make sure that we keep this as an issue to keep moving forward on? I know, I don't know if I was the one that brought up reverse thrust. I think that came up at the full roundtable. And I think I was thinking more about 19 arrivals or 1 arrivals. The 1 arrivals with reverse thrust would hit Millbrae, Burlingame, and Hillsborough on that.
I think you should continue, if you don't mind, I think you should continue to get feedback because you've got some great resources here with Kathleen and Bert and other folks. See what kind of, and even your public, see what kind of direction you're starting to get on this, and you can give feedback on the rest, and even Justin can provide feedback on what he recommends, and then we don't have to say, okay, go forth today. We can say, okay, well, there's a lot more questions to ask. Let's pause and come back with more information.
I would.
Councilman Royce, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I would put that aside for now, but keep it on the back burner in the parking lot, as I say, for us to maybe come back to, because I don't think we know what the impact is. So it's really hard to make a determination whether we should determine the extent of that impact or how you can mitigate it. But at some point in time, if enough people are hearing that they think that's the cause of their noise, I think we need to explore it. And Justin, maybe that's one of those add-ons that we get a bid on and see how much work it would take and what we think the result would be.
And excuse me, through the chair, I did see Kathleen, Ms. Wentworth hands up earlier, and I also have a hand raised from Peter Gray whenever we're ready.
Okay. Kathleen, go ahead, please.
No, I'll pass. Thank you. You guys
Okay.
covered it.
Can I have one more question, Madam Mayor, or excuse me, Chair?
Yeah, please, go ahead.
With respect to this either or on 29 right or 21 left, are we talking about a cost issue, or are we talking about the fact we don't think 28 left has any real impact? But why are we saying we have to choose between the two?
It was, oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I think it's when we first set aside the cost of the project, we hadn't considered 28 at all. And then because of the pandemic and the reduction of flights, it became easier to hear where noise was coming from. So we were able to add a 28. If we don't have enough money to do both 28 left and right, Justin is recommending which one might actually be causing more of the problem. I also don't know, and Bert would probably know, if there are more 28 right takeoffs than lefts too.
There are typically more takeoffs on left, although there are more arrivals on 28 right, particularly at night.
Maybe the other answer then is how much more would it be to do it for both a 28 left and a 28 right? And is it worth it to us to come up with that additional money to do both and have the data, or at least have the modeling done for both runways? Where are your thoughts, Councilman Linda, and what are the thoughts on that? And Justin, would you have any idea how much more money it would be to do both runways?
Not off the top of my head, but one recommendation I would throw out there is, as you're discussing, sort of holding off on a few things like reverse thrust, maybe holding off on scenario 6, because what we might be doing here is, as we go through scenario 1 through 5 and we're modeling it and completing the memo, we'll have a better sense too of where we are within the allotted budget, and that would give me more comfort in figuring out if we could add additional scenarios, or add or include both runway 28 left and 28 right, But it's hard to know just initially offhand from the start. This was my best estimate of kind of getting through scenario 1 through 5.
Yeah, to me, the scenario 6 isn't so much an issue with vegetation. It's just if the new hotel is actually now moving noise that didn't normally travel into Millbrae, Burlingame, Hillsborough, but now is because of that curve of the hotel capturing and amplifying the noise in our direction, because that's my theory. But Kathleen, or I'm sorry, Linda and Michelle did most of the negotiations with that. Linda, where would you be if part of me says, yeah, it makes sense to hold off on 6, but if we've already spent all the money through 1 for 5, we will never know if the hotel added new impacts, which to me then leads to any other additional expansion of airport buildings and its impacts on us. But Linda, what's your opinion?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, that turns into a question for Justin, which you might have just addressed, but which is the flexibility towards the end of the study. And in other words, if you do scenarios 1 through 5, and there still remains room in the scope, is it possible, you could be 95% finished with the whole thing and then add a scenario, or do you have to do the scenarios in a certain order? I mean, what's the sort of chicken egg about that?
I think we'll know relatively quickly. These scenarios, once everything's digitized and inputted, it's a matter of, just going through the model and kind of cranking them out, so to speak, within the scenarios. It's just all the setup time and, getting things correct in terms of the model. So
the setup time would be the same for whether you do 3 scenarios or 6 scenarios.
No, just because the placement of the aircraft, the angle, it's a little bit more setup time. And I'm not the modeler, so I don't want to, don't hold me to this. They'd probably kill me for saying it shouldn't be that difficult. But I just feel like I'll know relatively early on when we actually have some of this information in and we're about to hit run, what it looks like in terms of the scope and budget. If these things could, if scenario 1 we could do both, then great. I'll put it in there without any issues, right? And then if there's something else, we could bring that back to you.
Okay, at this point, any comments again from the panelists? It looks like right now we're okay with 1 through 5. We're trying to figure out if we should delay on 6. And I don't see anybody's hands, and most of us aren't on visual. Do we have a public? We have a
Yes,
Peter
we
Grace.
do. Yes, we have Mr. Peter Grace. Please accept this request to unmute your microphone.
Hi, this is Peter Grace from Brisbane. Are you able to hear me?
We are.
Justin, I realize you've done this before, but my apologies. Do you have a map that shows the location of the start-off roll for runway 1 and 1, both L and R, and the secondary takeoff point for 1L and 1R? And then can you show on us whether this takeoff point has changed over time, over years? So it's where are these takeoff points for 1L and 1R, and also probably 28, and also whether these takeoff points, primary and secondary, have changed over time. Thank you. I'll mute my microphone.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Peter.
Are you checking, Justin?
I'm just taking down some notes. We don't have, I mean, this is, let's just say this is technically the start of the project for us. We've done some of that pre-work in terms of modeling. I don't have the location yet, and this is one of the follow-up discussions I need to have with Bert regarding confirming takeoff roll point and secondary takeoff point, additionally with aircraft types. So it is something, thank you, Peter, for bringing up, because we do need to have those discussions. And what I'll say is that, and I believe this has been discussed before, in terms of aircraft types, we were going to use the predominant aircraft types taking off. And I believe Bert has gotten me that information. And in regards to takeoff and secondary point, we were going to look at the most current data regarding that. And it would probably be an average point. It could be a worst case point too, but it's something that I would have to talk to Bert about, looking at the actual data, the radar data.
As far as the, if I may offer, as far as
Yes, please.
start of takeoff roll point, you can assume where the taxiway line into the runway, in the runway center line is a good point.
Yeah.
For power
So,
point.
but actually that to me brings up a good point. If we were talking about changes at the airport over time and why we are experiencing an increase in noise, is that both one left and one right were extended closer into Millbrae. So one by 250 feet and one by 400 feet. That would have changed the, make sure I'm using the start of the roll and the secondary takeoff points, wouldn't it?
They would be the same for both. So if you take where the taxiway intersects the runway center line where they roll into the runway, whether it be further down or closer in, it would be the same.
It's Friday morning. I'm not getting that. Why move the runways closer to Millbrae if the takeoff points are at the same place?
No. So if scenario A, we have it 100 feet further away from the community, then that takeoff point would be, start of power point would be 100 feet further away. If we bring that runway and taxiway 100 feet closer to the community, then it would be 100 feet closer. So Justin's bringing up a map here. And yeah, so there's the taxiway intersection point with the runway center line for that taxiway.
Right here.
Yep. And then whether it be there or it be further up, then that's where it would be for each scenario.
So it's based on the current operations, not a comparison to past operations.
That would be correct in terms
Justin's
of what we're
model.
proposing for the model. Yes, current.
Now, one question I did goes back to the 3D terrain. Are we modeling the Millbrae Gateway construction? Or are we keeping it current?
Well, right now it's up to its third floor on one building, but yes, that will do something.
So on something like that, yeah, we would need, that's a great point, Bert. And thank you for bringing that up. We would need the GIS files. So the GIS files that we're pulling are existing constructed buildings. So we would probably need anything that's planned or future if those GIS
hey, stranger,
files
how you
are
doing?
available.
Bert, you'll
I
need
can-
to mute yourself.
Okay. And I thought part of the spectral analysis study was going back and comparing noise input from existing monitors adjusted for low frequency noise?
We did do that in the past spectral study where we looked at actual measurement data at various points in time. However, for the modeling purposes of determining the existing noise environment and the reflections, we were focused on existing conditions as they currently stand.
Okay, maybe that's what I need to get my head wrapped around, that this study is looking at existing conditions, existing terrain, and how we might mitigate some of the noise by using vegetation as one example.
Correct.
Let's,
Correct.
because I kept
Yes.
putting it in my head, it was a spectral analysis on that.
Yep.
Okay. Any other questions? Go ahead, Michelle.
One question, and I don't know if Bert's on the phone or not, but with the proposed strategic plan and the development plan update, is there any plan changes to any of these runways that we should be considering now? And I realize it's an existing conditions baseline study, but I just wanted to question that because of the Millbrae point that was brought up.
Mhm. You might be on.
As
Yeah,
far as the
Oh, there we go.
runways, taxiways in that area, I think we're static for a while.
Thanks, Bert.
But I believe Ivar said at the roundtable that they're going forward with the environmental work, the environmental documentation work for future airport expansions. And for example, the hotel was approved back in a 1992 plan, even though it was only recently constructed. So we as the roundtable need to keep an eye on things, because something 20 years from now, if we don't comment it now, it may be affecting our communities well into the future. And because it turns out that projects built like the hotel did not have to go through our own CCAG Airport Land Use Committee. So it completely bypassed us. Okay, any other questions then? Justin, go back to your presentation. Thank you for taking all our questions.
No problem. Let's go back to the scope. So before we move on to the next item, we'll talk quickly just about what we're going to be generating. We'll be generating basically LMAX noise contours. That will be kind of like, it's not necessarily contour lines. There will be contour lines, but you'll have a sense, it will look like a heat map. So you could see the changes in noise, and you'll also be able to see certain reflections that are occurring off of buildings. We'll be incorporating those figures into a technical memo. We'll also be including tables of the 12 receiver points results. So the noise levels on a spectral basis at each of the receiver points for each scenario. And we'll try to break that up in a fashion that you'll be able to easily compare the difference between the scenarios, and specifically with and without vegetation. The tech memo will talk about some of the previous literature review and kind of the like a general understanding of ground-based noise. And then we'll also make some recommendations to the committee for next steps based off of the data that we see, the results that we see. And we're anticipating, we have a good head start on, and like I said, a lot of that GIS data input is the time consuming portion of this. And so we said 30 to 45 business days. I think we're in the 30-day time frame currently. And once we have some of these other items nailed down, we'll be off to a really good start and be able to get you a draft technical memo within that time frame.
Comment, go ahead, Al. You're on mute.
There we go. I had a phone ring and so I had to mute it here. Just a quick comment. Once the study is done and you've got the models in place, I assume it wouldn't be hard to add another control feature to it. Instead of vegetation, if you want to add it something else to test that. Is that correct or wrong?
That's correct. Yeah, that is correct. Yeah, to add, let's say, for example, you wanted a barrier in X location with this height. At that point, you know, everything's kind of inputted. We have various aircraft spectral data inputted and source points. It's just a matter of kind of stepping through the model, hitting run, and creating a figure or a table of the results.
Great. So this
You're
model
correct.
then could be used for long-term studies as well, or testing as well, right? Good.
I would, yes. Yep, I would agree.
Good. Thank you.
Madam Chair, if I could, because
Please go ahead.
my comment has to do exactly what I think ties in very well with what Councilmember Royce just brought up. We have a lot of construction in the northern part of Burlingame and southern part of Millbrae that I think is going to have some impact. So again, I would like that at some point, and I don't know if it could be during this study or maybe a subsequent study, to take into consideration the new buildings that we're approving right now. There's some large projects going on that I think might have an impact.
I agree. I would also add that I think eventually, and it may not be this study, if there are certain construction materials that are better at absorbing noise than deflecting noise, and we could get that. I'm sorry, developers, because I tried to do this for our Gateway project, to have them build with materials that would better absorb than bounce noise. But ultimately, we need a list of materials that can do that. And maybe they can't do it yet, or maybe it's the shapes of buildings or things like that. That would be a great outcome. I don't think we'll get it from this study, but we can get a step closer. And then maybe there are other airports and roundtables looking at this around the world. But I think that's important. The question then for us as elected officials is, how can we make sure that our projects are, I guess, sending the data to us so that we know what the shape or height. I mean, I know the shape or height, but even our second TOD project, which is on hold right now because of high-speed rail, it's going to have its own set of impacts because it's going to be 10 stories tall, and it's starting at 20 feet above sea level. So good points.
And Ms. Wentworth has her hand raised.
Okay.
Kathleen?
Justin, just one follow-up question on the ones that
Sure.
Ricardo and Al are talking about. And then is there any data that might be missing or omitted from this study for financial reasons that would be helpful for future add-ons to model any potential operational changes? In other words, if we staggered the aircraft not at a quarter mile between takeoffs, but half a mile between takeoffs, and that kind of thing. So are we capturing in this setup study the ability to look at that down the road?
I would say yes. I think the ability to do those alternatives will be a lot easier moving forward because of just the base that we've created, and even you'll see with the project study area that we propose, that it's relatively dynamic in that it's not that the data ends where we're kind of defining the area. It extends beyond that. So the base is there for future alternatives.
Thanks.
I know most people probably haven't had a chance to read the comments that Darlene Yapley sent through. So I think it goes to this agenda item. Let me read a couple of these in here and tell me if these were something that will be included in this study. The first one was, how will we be identifying noise events? Are we going to use a threshold and a duration method? Justin?
Well, we're not, this isn't dealing with noise detection or the ability, these aren't noise monitors, they're receptor points. So they're capturing the noise regardless of whatever's going on at the source. It's going to propagate out to the receiver. So I think those are two separate items.
Okay, and that's
And,
not
and
then under
we're
the
doing the LMAX contour, so it's basically the highest level that the receiver would experience in terms of noise. Sorry.
Yeah, again, it's because my brain hasn't been on noise the last month or two. I'm still trying to absorb this in. So right now we're just looking at the noise occurs, what might mitigate the noise, and not mitigate the noise at, say, 80 decibels versus 50 decibels.
You would see, in terms of vegetation, you would see what kind of reduction would occur with and without the vegetation. So you would see that change potentially. We don't know what that change would be, but you could see, one receiver point behind the vegetation at 70, and then with the vegetation all of a sudden go down to 60. And that would be an LMAX. So you would see that there's really a delta change of 10 dB.
Okay.
That makes sense.
I'm looking through Darlene's comments here, and I think a lot of this is what we would, like the difference, the number, because we're not really talking, this study isn't trying to measure the number of events. It's trying to figure out when an event occurs, what might mitigate. So Darlene goes on to talk about the different LMAX levels of 50 in 5 unit increments up to 75 or greater, and then the duration. Some of the things I think we've talked about at the roundtable level of how we measure noise and annoyance on there. But I know Darlene is on the call. Darlene, if I haven't looked at your events, your comments may not be specific to the particular study we're working on now. They're good comments in terms of our overall annoyance and inability to sleep, but maybe doesn't work here. I don't have anything at this moment. Any of the committee members or panelists, any comments? And we'll move over to attendees. Okay. And I've got my camera off only because I'm looking so close into the documents, you would see. At any rate, let's go over to attendees, and Angela, it's in your court.
Yes, we do have 2 hands raised. First from Peter Grace and second from Darlene. So Peter, please accept this request to unmute your microphone.
Hi, this is Peter Grace. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, really it's a question for Justin about LMAX and what it is that you're really measuring. Because does this LMAX figure vary by frequency? I just don't understand how it relates to, if I look at tables 1, 2, 3 of the spectral analysis, what are those frequencies is LMAX? And then secondly, having built the model, how do we validate the model against what we validate it against? Results from the noise monitor, because the noise monitors at the moment, please correct me, Bert, they are measuring A-weighted, but I understand with some, they can actually take the noise profile and look at both A-weighted and C-weighted. And I'm going on a bit here, but I thought that C-weighted was a better method for measuring low frequencies than A-weighted. So I realize this is a multi-part question, Justin. So I hope you can tell me what you're actually measuring with LMAX. Is it one particular frequency or multiple frequencies? And then, is it unweighted or A-weighted or C-weighted or what? So I realize this may have been covered before, but thanks a lot for bearing with me.
No problem.
Thank you,
And
Peter.
I'm stopping, before I get more confusing.
I understood you. Yeah, no problem.
So Justin, can
Would
you
you like
help?
me to respond to that?
Yes, please.
Yes, please.
Sure. So we will be doing, our plan was to do LMAX in the full spectrum of frequencies, which is basically the worst case instantaneous noise level, at a unweighted level. So we're not going to filter based off of any, weightings. It's going to be unfiltered, basically raw data out of the noise source. We do have the ability to do weightings though. That's not really a problem. And that's why we really wanted to look at unweighted, because it's the raw data as it's, you know, there's no reduction being or curve fitting that's being done. In terms of the multi-point, I think to your point regarding looking at, I guess what I would say, I'm trying to follow my notes here as you were talking, but I think the key here is looking at the delta difference between scenarios. I think this model will provide an understanding of how noise propagates on a frequency basis, unweighted, throughout the community. And then when you put in various types of potential mitigation, it's really the with and without. Oh, and this gets back, now I remember what it was in terms of validating the model. The key here is in terms of validating what we're looking at is not necessarily does the existing noise model match a current scenario. You know, the model is relatively accurate in terms of we're going to be inputting the aircraft noise spectrum and propagating it with its directivity of the aircraft, and the accuracy of the model is based off of the standards in which it's calculating, you know, distance reduction and reflections. And really what we're trying to do here is look at with and without and the delta difference to see if there's any change in noise levels resulting from any of the mitigation alternatives. Hopefully that somewhat makes sense. I know I was trying to capture everything, Peter.
Before we go on to Darlene, are there any panelists that want to follow up with Justin on that? Okay, if not, then Angela.
Arlene, please accept this request to unmute your microphone.
Hi, this is Darlene. Thank you so much. I just wanted to follow up on the question that Peter asked, which is, I think there's a sense that DBC captures the ground-based noise low frequencies better. Justin, you mentioned that you're going to do unweighted, but I think it's also useful to look at how weighting would have a factor that would be more sensitive to ground-based noise. So I understand you said unweighted, but it's unclear how we're actually going to see the data in the report. So that's number one. The second is there's a tendency in a lot of reports to show a lot of averages. And although this isn't the same as the other noise monitors, I'm just wondering if it's useful to categorize ranges of noise increments. So you said, you know, is it going to be significant if you have vegetation or not? But what is significant, and to have different ranges of significance, and then we can argue later about how significant it is. But if someone chooses what's significant, that's going to greatly determine how the data is displayed. So I would encourage a range of significance so that you can then discuss and judge whether, you know, a certain level is going to make a difference or not to the citizens. So I would encourage that. And then lastly, I think it's also helpful to look at the data in terms of the report time of the event. So day events, early morning events, evening events, night events, to see how that may be a factor in the noise. Thank you very much.
Okay. I will take a stab at those. C weighting, understood. I think we will look at that a little bit more in terms of what we're reporting. And that once we have the unweighted values, it's relatively easy for us to determine C weighted too. So we could potentially include both. So I will get together with our team to discuss that and see also based off of the results what makes the most sense. Significance range, I don't think we were going to define that. I think we're looking at reporting the results as they stand to you and to the subcommittee in terms of the memo, and letting you determine if something such as vegetation provides what you think is a significant amount of noise reduction on a frequency basis, because that could obviously vary. We could use general acoustic principles of, determining, something, a change, whether a change is detectable by the human ear. But this study really isn't meant to, I guess, comply with some federal regulation. It's really meant for you and to determine if certain alternatives and potential mitigation would be effective. So I think we'll look at the data and we're going to report it as it is, and provide those overall conclusions to you. And we'll look to make some recommendations based off of what we see. But it's noted. I appreciate that. And the report time, or in terms of time duration, it's not really a characteristic of LMAX. And for the purpose of this study, like I said, we're really looking at with and without, and the delta changes that occur. Obviously, you could consider time in terms of when you look at this LMAX contour, for example, for, whatever run, one left, you could consider time as in that this is the contour, this is the noise footprint, LMAX wise, for this type of aircraft, regardless. So, whenever it actually is operating, whether it's day or night, it would be the same in terms of LMAX.
Madam
So I
Chair,
hope that
I'm sorry.
makes sense.
I saw,
Okay.
Councilman Ortiz, go ahead.
I'm just sorry I have to drop off, guys. I have to run to work. So thank you for everything. That's been a good meeting. So thank you. Talk to you soon.
Okay, thank you.
And can I encourage us to move on to the two other points? We need to have some discussion on the
Yes.
12 receiver points and then the vegetation types and heights.
Okay,
Good points, everybody.
Yes, I greatly appreciate it. Thank you for the comments. I have all this noted. So
we're on to agenda, we're on to vegetation types. So we talked about the 12 receiver points.
well, real quickly before we move on to vegetation types, I want to show you, and hopefully you could see my Google Earth image here, of the potential receiver locations. And this is really what HMH would recommend. It isn't to say that we don't necessarily, if you wanted to move these, we can. You'll notice that some of these in red are actual NMT, locations that actually occur. It's not to say we're not using the data from those NMTs. We're just using the same location. And that might be just beneficial from looking at maybe in the future results compared to actual data. So co-locating them, we think is a good idea if you were to, want to analyze later on and compare apples to apples. We also recommended yellow, sort of various other locations, and this really has to do with getting kind of a sampling around the community of the noise levels. These, I will say that you're going to get contours in a heat map that covers all this entire area. So you'll be able to generally see what the noise is, you know, at a home by this roadway, you'll be able to see it. But what these receiver points are doing are actually telling you the actual value at that location. And especially important when you are looking at with and without vegetation or a mitigation alternative, you'll be able to see the change in that value that's occurred based off of that. HMH, based off of our discussion here shortly regarding the vegetation, which I think is the most important thing we need to determine right now, is we may add additional points based off of the location of that vegetation, only because we want to capture nearby, kind of putting between the source and the receiver that vegetation. So we might place some additional receivers right behind the vegetation, but these are per the scope, the 12 proposed receiver locations. And so please let me know your thoughts.
We don't have Councilman Ortiz here. I see that in Burlingame, we're going to use the 2 existing monitors and then adding a few more up into Mills Estates. Those are the scale is small, so I can't read what you've called them, but they're between, no, come on down. Or
These guys?
no, that's actually in Millbrae. If you look at the bottom 2, the bottom of the
Oh,
map.
yes, yes.
Yeah, those 2 are in
NM2, 10 and
Burlingame.
11.
Yeah,
Right.
and that road above it is Truesdale. And then you've got 2 yellow additions. That's Millbrae Estates or Mills Estates, which actually Burlingame and Millbrae, there's just this weird line dictated by the Supreme Court that divides us on there. You put a few up interesting into SFPUC land, I can see, on the top of our hill. And then it looks like 1 near City Hall. I'm just wondering if Burlingame or Al, if you feel like would this capture the changes that I think some of the some of the Burlingame people have said, you know, when they created that committee, that they're hearing more noise now. Why are they hearing more noise if we're going to capture that?
Yeah, I actually would like to run that by maybe 1 or 2 of those people, but my gut reaction is this probably tells you where this probably does it. And again, I'm having trouble seeing the map, frankly.
Yeah.
But if these are the 2
Zoom in a little more. Yeah, thank
That's
you.
better. Yeah.
Yeah, my guess is that probably because you're looking for some sort of indicator, not necessarily exact. And this probably gives you that. But I'd actually would like to run it by 1 or 2 of those people to see if they have any qualms or if they think we're missing something here.
I would love to run it past our city engineers too, and I would imagine maybe Burlingame does too.
Yeah.
I'm pretty familiar, given that this is my home territory, of the slope here. And I hadn't really used the term before. I'd been talking about the hotel, but my city manager, when we were talking about this, said, yeah, Millbrae basically acts like one big amphitheater. So the noise starts at the airport and then comes up the hills and concentrates as it goes. A good example, and it's a shame Burlingame's not on, they've opened up a temporary concert venue. And we heard it as if we were at the concert here in my neighborhood. So our hills do some kind of amplification. On one side, you could say, hey, that's really cool when it's music. It's different when it's noise. So my question for Burlingame and Hillsborough are we going to be able to see how the hills are moving the sound up and concentrating it to like what I believe Councilman Royce people feel in Hillsborough at the top of the hill?
Yeah. Yeah, actually, that's a great point, Dan. I wonder what would happen if you put one down over here somewhere down on the south part of those hills, just to see what comes over the top. Is that amplifying it, or is that barrier? See, right? Yeah,
Okay.
right with the arrows.
Yeah.
That might be interesting to know. I'd assumed it was a barrier, but based on what you just said, that might be totally wrong.
Well, you know, it's all just conjecture or theory. We don't have anything to kind of do it. I think that's the exciting part of the study. If we can, so Justin, you're saying all those monitors, you'll then take the noise data and you'll be able to draw a plume, basically, based on where the noise is going and other data points.
Yeah, you in the contour figure, you'll see a heat map throughout this whole area of the noise levels. You'll see it for every area. It's just these receiver points are pinpoints of those locations. So it might not be very specific, right? Like the contour is going to show you a bluish color that looks like it's in the 60 range, right? And you'll get a sense of how things are reflecting or if they're amplifying. What the receiver's doing is telling you it's 60.4 at that location. And why that's important then is that when you do with and without vegetation or something else, you'll be able to see if there's a change at that location. You'll still see a change based on potentially on a contour, but what I'm saying here is these receivers just help you get pinpoint accuracy of change, and that's why we've kind of spread them out throughout this area. Hopefully
So
that
where
makes
you're
sense.
blinking that yellow light, is there one there, or is that where you're suggesting maybe one could go?
Yeah, I think that was based off of what Al was saying.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just now.
yeah.
Somewhere in this area to see
Yep.
the effects of
Yeah.
this. Yeah.
And that would give more data for the Burlingame people. So if we did want to look at your suggestions here and take it back to our technical people, although none of us are noise, I don't think any of my engineers, okay, our 1 or 2 engineers on our staff are noise specialists, but I would like to run this. How would this delay moving forward with the project, or would you just give us a date to have everybody kind of touch base? Or should this go to the full roundtable, which is in 3 weeks?
I would, I mean, my opinion is I could easily provide this as a KMZ file, or even just a KMZ file for them and an image in combination. And we could request it by a certain date back or comments back. I would be, even if they were to take a KMZ file and add their own point that they think should be noted to it and send it back to me, that would be appreciated. But Michelle, what are your thoughts on that process?
I really like that idea that we develop kind of a cover memo with the KMZ file and then the image request with a deadline, and give them that alternative to provide their own relocation on the KMZ or just a point on there. And then and I guess my question back to Mr. Royce and the chair was, do we want to send it to the entire membership, or are we only sending it to certain folks? But I love the idea of getting better feedback, not taking it to the full membership, because really we want to update them on the decisions that you're making and the progress you're making, very quick fashion, but really the details rest with this committee. So let's keep it there.
Al, I'll ask you, but Linda, go ahead.
I was just going to recommend, per Michelle's point, maybe just to include the members of this committee, which would include obviously Chair Ortiz and Supervisor Pine. And I think if someone from San Bruno wants to participate as well. But I wanted to clarify something with Justin, that these are essentially virtual receiver points that are included in the model. You don't actually have a monitor stuck at those points, right?
That's correct. Yeah, these are just virtual points in the model. Correct.
Yeah. So I would definitely recommend that, in addition to the untitled place mark that you put down there, we probably want another 1 or 2 farther south. So pursuant to Chair Schneider's, evaluation of the Millbrae points, probably move a couple of those down into Burlingame, pending also, I think Chair Ortiz will have something to say about that.
Justin, if you're free, I'd almost like to get you on a phone call with their city engineer, because I think that'd be the most productive use of his time, because I'm not sure he'll fully understand what I'm trying to say, because I'm not sure I fully understand.
I'm right with you, Al. I mean, this is complicated stuff.
But if you're willing, maybe we just set up a 30-minute phone call. Maybe the 3 city engineers, Burlingame, Millbrae, and Hillsborough, just have a quick conversation with you, not to go through what you said, but just to get to this point. What we're trying to do and that might be the most feasible way of doing this.
That sounds fine to me. I'd be happy to do that. Michelle,
And
what are your
Justin,
thoughts on that? Do you have
I
any
would, I'm
concerns?
sorry, Justin.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to ask Michelle what her thoughts are on, you know, my inclusion on a call like that and making sure that's okay. I think it would be productive though. Michelle, you're on mute.
I think that we can, do like a 30-minute thing as long as we send the material ahead of time so people can view it, because I think this
Sure.
can't see it well enough here, and
Yeah.
easily a 30-minute, call to get them to this point. So then maybe just a little background, maybe the scope of work might help them to understand. But we're happy to coordinate that.
Sure.
And then in terms of timing, Michelle, we're, what are we today? We are the 6th. We've got Thanksgiving coming up, and then we've got the roundtable right after that. Would we want to give 10 days out from today? Is that reasonable, or is that too short?
Oh, that sounds fine to me. We'll coordinate with Justin on his availability and our availability and get you out some dates so that you got to give us the names of the people we'd be coordinating with, because that's, unless you want to be in the middle of coordinating, that's the key point.
No, I know maybe the request would be for Linda, for Supervisor Pine's office, Ricardo, Alan, myself, is we will go back to our city managers, identify the key staff people, and make sure that our key staff people comment in a timely fashion on that. It's funny, I'm looking at the map, and if you see that big green area that to me is obviously a golf course, I don't know if it's obviously a golf course. Yeah, there you go. That neighborhood above it is actually quite a bit higher in elevation. However, that neighborhood above to the left, to the left of this is the Meadows neighborhood. This was actually a hill that was carved out to create the airport. And I was walking precincts a couple of weeks ago and was amazed at how loud it was. But so because even above that is another hill, that industrial site here, well, up at the top of the hill is actually where our water purification comes from, the Hetch Hetchy system. And the sound tends to bounce around in this cup shape up there. And, you learn a lot when you're out precinct walking, because you're actually hearing your community. And I just was pretty amazed. And then on top of it, we had overflights coming right down that neighborhood. So I'm hearing backblast noise and I'm hearing overflight noise. And the overflight noise duration was a good 3 or 4 minutes long. So I probably will try to find some time to run around the neighborhood for the next couple of days too, or go out with our own engineers. Al, I don't know if you want to do that with your folks.
Yeah, I might do that. That's a good idea. That's a good idea.
It's just, again, the shape of land can do some really interesting things. You'd think meadows would be protected up there, but on that particular day that had a slight overcast, the sound was bouncing right in there and was pretty significant.
Yeah.
So, okay, 10 days out, we'll send it out and get our engineers to comment. And I'll give a call to Rico Medina, the mayor of San Bruno, and see who might be assigned the next time, because Laura didn't run for election. So we're going to have yet another new San Bruno member.
Okay. Yeah,
Okay, should we go on into the final agenda item on the vegetation type?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Michelle.
Okay. Let me switch over to that. So before I bring up a map to kind of help us talk about the project study area and location of vegetation, I'll just quickly go through some of the, we had previously sent a memo regarding barrier effects and vegetation effects. And so I'll just kind of go through some of those high level acoustic effects of vegetation before we discuss that. So I've highlighted in green some of the major items here. In terms of vegetation and acoustics, density is key. The model doesn't necessarily, we don't necessarily need to define the types of trees or plants or shrubs that go in this area or areas, it really is about density, location, and height. And once you have a sense of that, once the model is run, you would then be able to kind of pinpoint what that density looks like in terms of, trees and shrubs and various things. So I want to make that clear real quick that what we're looking at in terms of the model is density. And specifically, it's been found about 200 feet of continuous density is necessary to achieve 5 to 10 dB of reduction. And of course, it has to do with the geometry of the situation, which is why this study and modeling is important and interesting because of, like the Chair Ann said, it is a very unique area in terms of geography and the topography of the area. HMH will be using a certain standard, and I'll try to stay high level here, but it's an ISO standard in terms of vegetation effects, acoustic vegetation effects that's built into the noise model, which we previously detailed before. And it kind of shows that the reduction or attenuation really has to do with the propagation distance and where the vegetation is located. And for our purposes, this is all within the area that is being described in this table, 10 meters to 20 meters, but 20 meters to 200 meters in terms of the vegetation areas and the potential attenuation that's provided.
Justin, I'm sorry.
Go
You
ahead.
had said that the best thing was 200 feet of continuous density or 200 meters.
I believe it says 200 feet.
Okay,
Yes.
that's better.
Yes.
200 meters is much greater.
Yeah, it sure is. It sure is. Yes.
I think the 200 meters that you were just referring to, scroll down just again. That's the
Yes.
distance between the airplane, the runways and the house in your, but the 200 feet is the trees itself in your diagram. Is that?
Correct. Yes. It's 200 feet of continuous density or vegetation would be. So what you're trying to do is, obviously you're going to be within the confines of whatever location you're looking at, but you're trying to increase that amount of density as much as possible. And 200 feet gives you that range of reduction on average. So it's kind of just a starting point, right? It will change based off of how much density you have there and how many feet.
Yeah, I was
you
just
have
trying to
play with.
distinguish between the 200 feet in that paragraph and the 200
this one below.
meters in the ISO part.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes. Yep.
And I wanted
So-
Justin to review portions of his technical memo that is dated January 3rd, 2020, because I think when we think about the final recommendations and the use of this information later is, how is this going to inform either our membership speaking to their city managers to speak to developers on this, or Caltrans on this, or how do we communicate ultimately with Bert et al. On what are areas they'd like to keep clear and where are some opportunities, that kind of thing. So that's an important point. That 200 feet is of continuous density of whatever we choose is going to be good to know.
Mm-hmm. So, in terms of, we'll conclude with attenuation. Obviously, the closer in terms of mitigation, whether it's a barrier that's a berm or a wall or vegetation, where it's placed and how close it is to the source and receiver is key. But also you have terrain effects too, and breaking line of sight from the source to the receiver. And so all these things, that's, really the purpose of the model, factors in all those things into consideration, and then calculates that. So I think at this point, unless there's any other questions.
Justin, I'm
Yep,
sorry, I have
go
a
ahead.
question.
Sure.
Looking at the bottom diagram where
Mhm.
you've got a level surface and then you've got noise from point, and then where the trees might be doing the best job of blocking it. I get that. The problem is none of us are on a flat land area.
Right.
Do you think one of the outcomes of our study might be a diagram that reflects the same kind of concept, but what happens as sound is moving up a hill, up a slope?
We could potentially do that based off of the results we see in a cross section. I think the model even has the ability to do sort of like a cross section view that might actually be of what the actual situation.
Okay.
So I'll note that down and see if we could add that in. But I think I agree that would be good.
Yeah, just to
Um,
give you an idea,
this is
I am
just pulled
already
from-
running through my
Uh-huh.
head where we might have 200 feet of land to put a forest in, given that the land closest to the airport has 4 endangered species right there. But there is also Site 7, which the airport has told us they're going to keep as a construction zone for the next 20 years. But Site 7 could easily have 200 feet of trees. And then there's some other land that doesn't have the endangered species. But then I'm thinking of all of us that live slightly up the slope. We don't have 200 feet on El Camino Real. Maybe we could median strip 40 feet and get some trees growing up, given that Caltrain is looking at redesigning at least Burlingame's portion of El Camino Real and 1 block of Millbrae. I'm just already going into implementation, but maybe like for Hillsborough, there's a park that there might be other smaller things that we can do. It's going to be hard to find 200 feet.
And you gotta, yeah, it is. And plus you gotta overlap that with the concerns over wildfires, and you gotta overlap that with the concerns over affordable housing, the new marina allocation. So that'll be a challenge, but going up the hills is a big issue for us.
Yeah,
I'd like to know, does that reduce it or amplify it?
You know, I only know anecdotally, right after they changed the shelter in place rules to allow landscapers, my neighbor closer to the airport had 2 4.5, 5-story tall oak trees, and they cut them down, and we are significantly noisier just by the loss of those 2 oak trees. So but maybe it's in my head, maybe it's all being imagined in there. So I like to think that maybe even, and those trees, these were gorgeous trees, maybe 30 feet wide in their foliage up on, well, you can't see me, I don't have my camera on, 30 feet wide up on top. Maybe there's something along the hillside that it's not so much what it is at the bottom of the tree, but higher at the top of the tree.
Not directly on point, but somewhat related, is we talk about the type of vegetation does not make a big difference. Nevertheless, I do think because of the coming drought and water conditions, we ought to have some thoughts on what we'd recommend if we're going to have planning of stuff.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
And I've been
I
reading
think,
a lot
go
more
ahead.
about what becomes fire danger and what may not be as worse of a fire danger. So all of us, and Burlingame especially, who love their eucalyptus trees.
Yeah.
And I think that is something to potentially start considering. I think I wanted to let you know, for the purposes of this study and modeling, we're looking at really defining the location, potential height, and density. We're looking at density. So we'll elaborate a little bit more on that. But, yes.
Justin, do you need feedback from this committee regarding the potential locations of the vegetation? I mean, I see you have some green area there,
yeah.
but those areas that Chair Schneider was just mentioning, can you put in the model like the 200 feet of dense foliage?
We can, yes. I mean, that's exactly what we need. We need those locations defined, whether it's drawn in on an aerial. We could do all the digitizing and input, or if it's easier, if someone, looked at on Google Earth, created a, polygon over the aerial and sent me that. but we really need those locations or location, depending on what you're looking at here, defined, because that's what we'll run in the model.
So I'm going to add that to my list to sit down with our public works staff. Again, sadly, so much of that green area for Millbrae is land either owned by San Francisco Airport, SFPUC, and then given or protected by Fish and Bert, correct me, it's Fish and Wildlife. I get my state, my federal agencies for endangered species confused, but there's a very active endangered species program between those two neighborhoods. So kind of
There
off.
are. It's very much protected.
Yeah. At the same time, I think we could at least get a better mapping idea. The other thing that has happened along that area is the berm along 101 has been thinned over every 101 expansion, which also then takes away vegetation. And with the managed lane program, they're not planning on any noise mitigation at all because they didn't consider it any noise addition. So, but there's some opportunity there, maybe just along what would be Caltrain land. I don't know how thick it goes. So I think it's really, okay, I'm going to say this is fun, time for me to really dive into ownership of land and what's out there in a field trip. Yay.
Well, Madam
So,
Chair, if I may
Justin,
receive a
go ahead, Mark.
is I will bring it to our environmental team and see if, I don't know, I'm not volunteering anything at all because I'd be totally out of school. But I mean, if they were able to say, oh yeah, you could plant this, you know, something. But
I hate to put the pressure on you, Bert, but I'm looking at Site 7 and then the land just north of Site 7. That doesn't have endangered species. So, and that's the area closest to the two runway ones.
yeah, it is.
So maybe there's something we can do there that could help
Site
everybody.
7's a construction area that they
Right.
use for staging.
Right. And then there is, again, working with Caltrain right at the cloverleaf of the Millbrae Avenue exit. I think there are some other opportunities. There are some wetlands in there because there's tules in there. But, you know, nothing ventured, nothing gained.
Yeah, like I said, I will ask.
Thank you.
Justin, is there a radius that is appropriate for these suggested sites? Like if you start getting too far away from the airport, it is irrelevant.
Right. I mean, you're wanting it to be in between the source and the receiver, right? So obviously this green area here would be ideal. We will actually still model that as a certain terrain type. So it won't be considered, for example, concrete or pavement. So we will get the effects of whatever is existing currently there. But you're correct. You would want to place it in locations that, like the literature review said, either really close to the source or really close to the receiver, and definitely in between to where you break line of sight. So just keep that in mind. And I think in purposes of, you know, looking at it or sending us examples, we'd be happy to look at it and provide our feedback. But yes, just keep those principles in mind, that you want to break line of sight and you want to maximize the density, you know, 200 feet, think in that range, and it be between the source and receiver, or closer to one than the other, is always helpful.
I'd like to bring up something. It seems like we've got two things going on. One is that we've got this green area that might be an opportunity. And then we've started to hear some other ideas that are more inland, like medians, future park plans, projects that might come under development in the future, that might have some opportunities. But we want to balance that with wildfires and looking at, you know, RENA and drought tolerant and fire tolerant. And so how do we've almost got two things going on. One is one dense area that's an opportunity, and then all of these opportunities within the municipalities that we might be able to share. And so how does this relate to a combination of, well, I guess we're going to choose the receiver site. So that's one opportunity to get our baseline. But then how does that relate to what the model might ultimately pull out? Are we going to break down the final report into, if you have areas of this density at these receiver sites, it's going to be this, but then incrementally it's going to go lower? Or how is this really going to be beneficial for them to be able to take later to staff? How is this going to dwindle down? Or do we need to have a kickoff meeting with some folks to have some better conversations? Or I'm just, doesn't seem ready yet.
Yeah, for the purposes of the modeling and what we're trying to get out of it, it's kind of, you know, that whole thing about with and without vegetation. So if we identify these areas, one, obviously you said we're going to really nail down these receiver points, which I think will be good. And HMH will look to add any additional receiver points based off of where the vegetation is. But as we talk about those vegetation locations, we're really talking about, you know, either all those are on or they're off, and looking at the differences with and without vegetation at all of these receiver points, so that you will be able to understand if you went forward with planting whatever that you've identified for those locations, you could expect X dB of reduction in these frequencies. And obviously we would focus in on the low frequencies, but nevertheless, you'll get an understanding of all the frequencies. And I think that will help guide you in making a decision. Is this an effective, you know, is this something we want to proceed forward with in terms of, you know, putting vegetation in these locations?
This is way in the future. If you look at this current, if you look at the picture here, you can see where there are two creeks. They're actually cemented in creeks. One is Cohen Canal, it's shared between Millbrae and Burlingame, and then our Highline Canal. And we have been talking about taking these basically concreted in creeks and bringing them back to natural status. I was just talking about it. We have a new hotel going in where I was just talking to that developer yesterday about adding more trees. I think this is a long range plan as we redevelop these areas and we get stricter, that it's not just trees for pretty or trees for climate change, it's trees for noise. We have some opportunities, but I'm just looking at the two creeks in the mud flat there. Someday that could also have some additional tree coverage. 200 feet is trickier, but again, have to get out there and start putting out a measuring tape. And I'm still not sure if the trees there would help with the secondary takeoff point. Just in the overall heat map, it's going to show the difference between the starting point and the secondary takeoff. Will
That's
the
right.
sound be? Yeah.
You'll
So
be able
we
to
would need that
compare,
too.
You'll be able to compare those. Yes.
Okay. Cool. Any questions from the panelists? Any questions from the attendees? From the public? Any public comment?
We do not have any hands raised.
Okay, yeah, I don't see any hand raised. Justin, what do we need? So we've got,
Yeah.
what do we need? What do we need to do next?
Well, it looks like I will be getting a KMZ file with also an attached image with a cover letter to at least get you the information on these receiver locations, to then further follow up with a potential phone call discussion regarding with the appropriate people, of course, to have those discussions. And then what would be helpful is, and it could be part of that same discussion, but to have some sort of, we'll take whatever form is easiest, whether it's a drawn on image or on a Google Earth, but some sort of indication of the locations of potential vegetation.
And Justin, you're going to also have to talk to us about height. So wondering see that green strip running along the west side of 101 above Millbrae Avenue, that tiny little green strip that's left.
Yeah.
No, not on El Camino. Your cursor's on it. Go up to 101.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, there you go. So let's say we had 200 feet there, but you're X feet away from the 15% of the flights that land on one. How high could those trees be? And I
Right.
believe that's an FAA rule, isn't it?
It is a FAA rule. And on obstructions, what we were looking at, we internally were discussing that because we figured it might come up. And while we're not experts on that particular rule, we generally have an idea of what that actually involves.
Okay.
We would take a look at what existing heights are already there, and potentially then look at putting in something that we know is actually feasible, maximizing the height, but knowing obviously if there's already trees there that are say like 50 feet high, then we know that it's probably acceptable. But we would have, yeah.
Yeah, what's left up there are some straggly trees that sit up on a berm. But I have never walked out there. I would adore walking out there. And Linda, just for you to know, if you see that dirt path that runs curvily along 101, that is where I would love to see the future Bay Trail go. Again, this is protected area, but in Mountain View and other areas, they've got endangered species with paths that the public can use. Yeah, you can see they're fairly straggly. I don't know if
Really use some cleanup there for sure.
This is a pretty cool opportunity if we can get all of the various entities that control Millbrae, be it Caltrain, et cetera.
So I think,
Caltrans.
Just to clarify on that point, Justin, we could, let's say we put it in the model that you had the correct height and 200 feet worth of dense foliage. And the study kind of demonstrates that would have some impact on noise. Then after the fact, we would use that to go shop it around with the various agencies and see what we could come up with in terms of type of vegetation.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah, I think it's first important to determine what it looks like in terms of noise reduction, because you may realize that there isn't, or there is, and it's this amount. So I think it's first best to understand that and what's possible, and then you could, but in the meantime, you could probably start thinking of those potential things. And we'll take a look a little bit more regarding the heights and obstruction heights in regards to, this
Justin,
runway. You could see some of these trees are relatively already pretty high.
Justin, the berm, yeah, but not very thick, not dense. The
That's
berm
correct.
is what,
yes, in terms of height.
about 6 feet tall, maybe at its highest, the berm right there. And I think under the managed lane project, they've done some thinning probably since you've taken this photo. If we raised, just brainstorming, raise the berm, does that absorb sound? Ground, not cement.
Well, a berm would act, yeah. It would, yes, it would act as a barrier, but also it's a less obviously reflective barrier because you have some absorption characteristics to it that it's not like concrete. So berms can be used, and they're very effective, especially sometimes with a combination of a berm and a wall being at the top. So you have a berm and then less of a wall up top. Sometimes it could be 3 feet, but together in combination with the berm, you get a good effect.
I have to admit that I would rather have a berm plus vegetation than berm plus sound wall. especially since the technology of the sound walls simply bounce the sound. So,
Mhm.
but it's just an option that I play with. And I've spoken to Caltrans staff about the managed lane and what would happen to the berm. They said, oh, they have to take it, they're taking away a little bit of it, but I don't know if that's cutting the foot. I don't know what else is happening to the berm ultimately in the next 2 years. So there's activity happening right here, right now, and over the next 2 years.
And Kathleen had her hand raised earlier.
I think you guys just covered most of it, so thanks.
So as I understand it, the scope of work we're gonna proceed on with scenario 1 through 5, holding off on 6 while he looks more closely at whether he can include both runways and or the reverse thrust idea, looking more closely at that. On the modeling, we're gonna key everything to worst case scenario. We're going to try to get you the Millbrae development information. We are looking at whether the LMAX addresses low frequency noise. And on the points and on the landscaping, we're trying to identify locations on the maps. And so there sounds to me as if we're getting them the TMZ file along with a paper map and trying to host some type of a meeting with, it sounds like, I don't know if it's city engineers as well as parks folks, but I heard engineers, and that any landscaping that we identify, we're going to be cautious about focusing on drought tolerant and fire resistant. And that we're going to look a little bit or talk kind of offline a little bit more about the final report and the content of that and the kind of assumptions and so on. But it sounds like we've got some good recommendations about what to include there. That's what I got.
Can I throw one more thing into that, Michelle? We are looking at our sewage treatment plant in the goal of eventually getting it to tertiary water. So if we had plantings there, plants that can use recycled water. Sometimes recycled water has I'm guessing here, maybe a slightly higher chemical load on it, but that's the whole point of going tertiary, is to remove the chlorine and other things into it. But our sewage treatment plant is right there. And that would be a perfect way to reuse secondary or tertiary water. So in our plant shopping list. And what was the other thing? Yeah, back to the meeting. Al, do we still have Al?
I'm still
Al,
here.
if you had a meeting with Justin and your engineer, would you be open to making it a meeting, say, also with Millbrae's engineer, and we kind of,
Yes.
we have Justin go through it and then offer the same to Burlingame? So we do it all at one time? Okay,
Yes, that's
cool,
what I
cool.
was thinking. Yes.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Great minds, you know? Great.
You some dates about our availability, and we'll try to confine it to an hour if we think that's possible. And it's really an introduction to what we need for them. They can go off and do the work, and then we'll give them a deadline for the timeline to come back versus trying to do it all there. Does that sound reasonable?
That sounds great.
Sounds great. Sounds fine.
Excellent. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Justin.
Thank you, everyone.
Welcome.
Okay, so did we, any more comments from our panelists, from the members or from attendees? Then Michelle, do we have all of our walking orders from today?
Yes, ma'am.
Then yay, well done. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Again, I'm very excited to have both Angela and Michelle join us. And Linda looks so much more rested now. Lucky you. Any other questions?
Maybe if Linda and Justin could just stay on, that would be great. Or yeah, that would be great.
Excellent. Well, thank you all.
Sure.
It is the weekend. Have a lovely, safe weekend.
Thank you.
And I look forward to getting that letter, but I'm going to call my city manager right now and say, let's start getting some lovely maps. Justin, you had some amazing photographs of Millbrae. could you please send them to me? Because when I'm on the freeway, I'm usually driving and I just, a camera holder versus a cell phone, very dangerous. I'd love your photos if you could
Sure.
send them my way.
No problem.
Excellent.
Good, okay,
All
Thank you,
right, thank you.
everybody.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
well done.
Thank you. Or even, I don't know if Bert, do you have any feedback too? You want to stay on? That's
Well,
up to you
there's
too.
still somebody from the public.
Yeah, we're gonna
Just
wait.
give a second for everybody to hop.
Mhm.
There you
I
go.
was just gonna ask permission to stay on for,
Yeah, great. Sorry about that, Bert.
no problem.
It looks like Peter Grace has left. So.
Okay, wow, still a lot of more work to be done there. And